Right, so for the integumentary system, that's supposed to be made up of skin and then also accessory structures. The skin is supposed to have three different layers to it. It has an epidermis, a dermis, and then a hypodermis. The epidermis is supposed to be the outermost layer of skin. The dermis is the middle layer of the skin. And then the hypodermis is the lowest, innermost layer of skin. Sometimes the hypodermis is also known as the subcutaneous layer. So if you ever hear or see that word subcutaneous, you should know that it means the same thing as the hypodermis. Then for the accessory structures, that's supposed to be the hair, the nails, and the glands. We don't really need to worry too much about the nails, so we're just going to mostly focus on the hair and the glands. Right, this is a simple diagram that shows the different layers of the skin. How at the top there's an epidermis, and then in the middle there's a dermis, and then at the very, very bottom there's the hypodermis. Okay, now for the epidermis, we need to know that the epidermis is supposed to be made up of stratified squamous epithelia. So stratified is supposed to be more than one layer, and then squamous is supposed to mean very flat cells. So in other words, the epidermis is made up of more than one layer of very flat cells. The epidermis, we also need to know, is supposed to be avascular, meaning that there are no blood vessels in the epidermis at all. That's going to be important to remember later. The epidermis can either have 4 or 5 layers to it. If it has 4 layers to it, that's referred to as thin skin. But if the epidermis has 5 layers in it, then that's called thick skin. So we need to know that the thick skin with 5 layers, that's supposed to be found only on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. And so the rest of the body is going to have only the thin skin, the thin epidermis with only 4 layers in it. So the 5 layers that are found in the thick skin are going to be the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, the stratum granulosum, and then the stratum spinosum, and then the stratum basal. Sometimes the stratum basal is also known as the stratum germinativum. So if you ever hear or see that word stratum germinativum, then you should just know that it means the same thing as the stratum basal. Right, the little mnemonic that you can use to try to remember the order of the layers from outermost to innermost is supposed to be come, let's get sunburned. So, right, C is for corneum, L is for lucidum, G is for granulosum, S is for spinosum, and then B is for basal. Okay, then we need to know that for the cells of the epidermis, there's supposed to be basal cells, keratinocytes, melanocytes, Merkel cells, and then Langerhans. So for basal cells, we need to know that the basal cells, their name literally says where they're found. in the stratum basal. But the function of the basal cells, we need to know that the basal cells, they are meant to just divide repeatedly over and over and over again in order to make new skin cells. The main type of cell that the basal cells make is supposed to be keratinocytes. So the keratinocytes, those are supposed to be found in every single layer of the epidermis. The keratinocytes up at the top tend to be dead, but then the keratinocytes at the bottom are the ones that tend to be alive. And this is because there are no blood vessels in the epidermis at all. Definitely need to remember that. So that means that the keratinocytes near the bottom are the ones that are closest to the blood vessels in the epidermis. Or I'm sorry, they're closest to the blood vessels in the dermis. So they're the ones that have the closest access to nutrients. Versus the keratinocytes up at the top, they haven't had access to nutrients for a really, really long time. Then the main function of the keratinocytes is to literally make keratin. Keratin is supposed to be a hard, dry, waterproofing substance for cells. So this is supposed to be what makes the hair and the skin very tough and hard and durable. And then in fact, hair and nails will contain very densely packed keratin. Then the third type of cell in the skin is supposed to be melanocytes. And so the melanocytes, it's important to know that they're actually found in the stratum basal. This is really important to know because a lot of people mistakenly think that the melanocytes are up at the top in the stratum corneum, but they're not. They're at the very, very bottom in the stratum basal. The purpose of the melanocytes is to literally make melanin. Melanin is supposed to be the substance that gives skin its color, but it's also supposed to be the shield from the sun. So this is why people with darker skin tones, that means that they make more melanin, and therefore they have more protection from the sun. Versus people with lighter skin tones, that means that they make less melanin, and therefore they have less protection from the sun. Then the fourth type of cell are Merkel cells. So Merkel cells, those are supposed to be sensory receptors for the found in the stratum basal. And then for the Langerhans, so those are supposed to be specifically a type of white blood cell called macrophages. And so for macrophages, those are supposed to eat any dead debris or bacteria that get down into the skin. Okay, this is just a nice picture that shows all of the different cells of the epidermis. Okay, so all of those pinky purple cells, those are supposed to be keratinocytes. So you can see that they're the most numerous in the skin. And then also this is a good diagram to show that there are no blood vessels anywhere in the epidermis at all. The green cell in the middle is supposed to be a Langerhans. That's right. So we know that the Langerhans is supposed to be eating any dead debris or bacteria that get down into the skin. The blue star-shaped cell is supposed to be a Merkel cell, helping with sensation. And then you can see that the brown cell at the very, very bottom, that's actually the melanocyte. And so this is a really good visual clue that the melanocytes are found at the very, very bottom in the basal and not up at the top in the cornea. Okay, right. Now, and then right, the yellow cells, those are the basal cells dividing to make new skin cells. Okay, now let's take a look at the dermis. So we need to know that the dermis has two different layers to it. It has a papillary layer and then a reticular layer. So the papillary layer gets its name from what are called dermal papillae. And the dermal papillae are supposed to create fingerprints. Right, so that's the main thing to remember about the dermal papillae is that they create fingerprints. Then for the underneath the papillary layer, there's a reticular layer. The reticular layer, I like to call the reticular layer the busy layer because this is where you're going to find lots of blood vessels, hair follicles, nerves, and glands in a really high concentration. So you can see that there actually are some blood vessels and nerves in the reticular layer, I'm sorry, in the papillary layer, but just not quite as much as there are in the reticular layer. Okay, then for the hypodermis, we just need to know that the hypodermis is supposed to be made up of adipose tissue, and then adipose tissue is supposed to be fat, and then the purpose of fat is to try to trap heat, protect, and cushion. Okay, and then it also will help with energy storage because basically the fat can store a lot of energy. And so when the fat gets broken down, it's going to release a large amount of energy. Okay. Right now, this is just a simple comparison chart of all the different layers of the skin. So, right, the epidermis is just made up of cells and only cells, and then that's it. There's no blood vessels, there are no hair follicles, there's no glands, nothing. Just cells, and that's it. Then in the dermis is where you're going to begin to find blood vessels, hair follicles, nerves, and glands. So notice that the glands are only in the dermis. So if a question is asking, in which of the following layers would you find a sebaceous gland? Or even an eccrine sweat gland? Doesn't even matter what kind of gland it is. The only correct answer is the dermis. There are no blood vessels in there's basically no blood vessels in the epidermis, or I'm sorry, there's no glands in the epidermis or the hypodermis, only in the dermis. Okay. Now, right, the hypodermis is going to have blood vessels, um, nerves, and adipose. Okay, then for glands, so right, the glands, there's eccrine, apocrine, and sebaceous. The eccrine sweat glands, those are supposed to be the really watery sweat glands. And they secrete, right, basically, yes, they're mostly water, but they also secrete waste in the form of salt and urea. The eccrine sweat glands, we need to know that they're supposed to be found everywhere, all over the body. This is why if someone's working out really intensely or is extremely hot, they're going to sweat pretty much anywhere. and everywhere. But there are some places where the eccrine sweat glands are in higher concentrations. So they're going to be found in higher concentrations on the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, and the forehead. And all of that should make sense because when someone is nervous, one of the first places they sweat is their palms. Some people have really smelly shoes because their feet tend to sweat a lot. And then when people are hot, they tend to sweat from their forehead. Okay, then for the apocrine sweat glands, we need to know that the apocrine sweat glands, those are supposed to be the stinky sweat glands. Those are supposed to be found in the armpits and the groin. The apocrine sweat glands, they get activated during puberty, and they release secretions during certain emotions, such as arousal. Okay, then for the sebaceous glands, those are actually supposed to be, it's extremely important to know that those are not um, sweat glands, that those are actually supposed to be oil glands. And so those oil glands, right, they secrete sebum, and the sebum or the sebaceous glands, those are really supposed to be found everywhere, all over the body. And basically, they're going to help keep the hair and the skin very soft and smooth and flexible. All right. Everything makes sense so far?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, just checking. Right now for the hair, we need to know that hair is actually meant to help with protection. So for example, eyebrows, those are actually meant to prevent sweat from getting down into our eyes. And then eyelashes and nose hairs, we need to know that those are going to prevent things like dust, dirt, pollen, and particles from getting into the eyes and the nose. Then the hairs can also help with insulation. When a person becomes scared or cold, there is a small muscle that's attached to the hair called the erector pili muscle. The erector pili muscle pulls on the hair and makes the hair stand up straight. So in other words, it causes goosebumps. Okay, now for the next function of hair, the hairs can also help with sensation. At the base of every single hair, there's actually a nerve. And then the hair is going to act like motion detection on a camera. Okay, so basically, just like for a security camera, um, just like how for a security camera, when it detects motion, then what happens is that like when it detects motion, then the camera um, is going to become activated. But then usually it sends a notification to your phone and lets you know, hey, something is moving out here. So you might want to click on the notification and find out what's going on. Okay. And then in a similar way, whenever the hairs move, we need to know that that's going to activate the nerve at the base of the hair and essentially send a signal to the brain and let the brain know that something is causing that hair to move and making that hair move. And this is how we're going to feel things like wind and insects crawling on our skin. Right? Because the wind and the insects aren't really pushing hard enough to be detected by sense receptors in the skin. Instead, what happens is that the um, the wind and the insects are actually moving the hairs on the skin. And then that's how we're going to feel them. Okay, now let's take a look at the functions of the integumentary system in general. So the integumentary system in general, we need to know that that is it has several functions. So first of all, it's going to help with protection. So it's going to help protect, like act like a physical wall, and it's going to physically block and physically prevent things like UV rays, sunlight, dirt, bacteria, chemicals from getting into the skin. Yeah, physically block and physically prevent things from getting into the body. Okay, and then for the second function of the skin, so the second function of the skin is supposed to be for vitamin D. So when the skin is exposed to sunlight, there is a chemical in the skin that will convert into a partially active form of vitamin D. And so that vitamin D is going to be necessary for calcium absorption. Right, that's why we care so much about the vitamin D. And then of course that's going to affect the bone health. So we need to know that when children have a lack of vitamin D, they develop the condition rickets. Because if there's not enough vitamin D, then there's not enough calcium absorption. And then since calcium is what makes the bones strong, then if there's a lack of calcium, then the bones are going to be brittle. Okay, so right, that's what causes the rickets in the children. And then when adults have a lack of vitamin D, they develop the condition osteomalacia. And it's basically the same thing. The lack of vitamin D causes a lack of calcium absorption. The lack of calcium absorption causes the bones to become soft and brittle. Now for thermoregulation, the skin can help control body temperature through dilating blood vessels, constricting blood vessels, sweating, goosebumps, and shivering. So, for example, normal body temperature, when it starts to increase above normal, so the body starts to become too warm, then the body's response is going to be trying to decrease the body temperature back down to normal. So, in order to do that, the body will respond in two ways. There's going to be vasodilation and then sweating. So, the vasodilation is where the blood vessels in the dermis are going to get bigger and wider, and this will actually make it easier for the heat to escape. You can think about how people with fair skin, they may tend to look more red in the face when they're hot or after they've exercised, and that's because of the vasodilation. When the blood vessels are closer to the surface of the skin, they're more visible. Okay. Right, so right, they're more visible from the surface, which is going to make the skin look more reddish. Then the second response by the body is going to be sweating. So we need to know exactly like what is the sweat doing to keep us cool. So it actually has more to do with the water in sweat. So when you have to boil water for cooking, like to make pasta or to make hard-boiled eggs, it takes a long time for the water to heat up. And there's a reason for that. Because water has this specific ability to absorb a lot of heat without its temperature changing very much. And that's called having a high specific heat. So even though that's annoying when we're trying to cook something fast, it actually tends to be a good thing when we're talking about temperature regulation, because this means that the water in the sweat is going to be able to act like a huge sponge, and it's going to be able to soak up and absorb just this huge amount of heat from the blood vessel underneath it. Like I said, like a big sponge, just soaking it up. And so as the water in the sweat is able to soak up and absorb this heat from the blood vessel underneath it, technically that's taking the heat away from the body. It's removing the heat from the body. And so it's actually this loss of heat, the removal of heat, that causes us to become cooler, or in other words, colder. There is no such thing as an object gaining cold. An object really can only either gain heat or lose heat, and then that's it. So if an object gains heat, it becomes warmer, and if it loses heat, it becomes cooler. So technically, because the sweat is taking away the heat, that causes the body to become cooler. And so the name of this process, where the water in the sweat is going to be able to absorb enough heat to evaporate but by removing the heat and taking it away from the body, that's called evaporative cooling. There it is, evaporative cooling. So we just need to know that that is specifically how the sweat is cooling us, is through the evaporative cooling. Okay, now when a person becomes cold, we're going to have basically the opposite response. Instead of vasodilation, there will be vasoconstriction. So the vasoconstriction is it's like where the blood vessels in the dermis are going to become very tight and small and narrow. And this is to try to pull the blood vessels away from the surface of the skin. And by pulling the blood vessels away from the surface of the skin, it's going to keep the heat trapped within the body. And then by keeping the heat trapped within the body, that's going to help us stay warm. It's going to help conserve heat. The heat won't be able to escape. And then this is actually one reason why some people may look pale when they're cold, is because of that vasoconstriction. As it is pulling away from the surface of the skin, the blood vessels become less visible. And so because they become less visible, then like I said, it makes the person seem pale. Then the second response by the body is going to be goosebumps. The erector pili muscle is going to be able to pull on the hair and make the hair stand up straight. And when the hair stands up straight, that causes goosebumps. And then the goosebumps, basically, they will help create this little blanket of heat around the body. And it's going to act almost like a little blanket. The heat won't be able to escape very easily. It'll be trapped against the surface of the skin. Okay, now let's take a look at shivering. So shivering is supposed to be increased muscle contractions. And so every time that muscles contract, they're going to need energy in the form of ATP. And so the ATP is going to be used by breaking off the last phosphate bond. And so when the last phosphate bond is broken off, that's going to release energy. And the muscle is going to use most of that energy to contract. But some of that energy is going to be wasted in the form of heat. And the heat can be, or I lost my train of thought. Some of it's going to be wasted in the form of heat. And oh yes, the heat that's released is going to be absorbed by the bloodstream. And then when the blood absorbs that heat, then the body is going to become warmer. Okay, now let's take a look at some of the disorders of the skin. So you do need to be familiar with some of the body disorders for the TEAS, but you don't need to know them in great detail. You just need to know a brief summary of them. Almost like if a friend or family member asks you, "Hey, have you ever heard of this before?" You could say, "Yeah." And you could describe it in a sentence or two to them. Just really short summary of what the disorder is. Um, and then also you just need to know what body system it belongs with. Whether Addison's disease is like a respiratory disorder, an endocrine disorder, a respiratory disorder, or an immune disorder, that kind of thing. What body system it affects. So these are ones that affect the integumentary system. So albinism is supposed to be a genetic disorder that causes the melanocytes of the body to not be able to make any melanin at all. And so because of the lack of melanin, they tend to have very pale blonde hair, pale skin, and very pale eyes. But in addition to being just lacking melanin and looking different, it's actually a big problem because if we remember, melanin was supposed to be our protection from the sun. So if you don't have any melanin, you don't have any protection from the sun. So these people are extremely sensitive to sunlight. Very, very sensitive. And so while albinism is genetic and it affects the entire body, vitiligo is a little bit different. So vitiligo is where the melanocytes in certain areas stop being able to make melanin. And it's thought to be due to an autoimmune reaction. So basically, it's believed that the melanocytes are attacking, or I'm sorry, the immune system is attacking the melanocytes in a certain area. And then when they attack them, then the melanocytes in that area die. And then if they die, they're going to stop making melanin. And so they're just going to stop making melanin in that specific area. So that's one of the biggest differences between albinism and vitiligo is albinism is all over and that vitiligo is just in patches. And then also the other difference is right that vitiligo or albinism is just genetic. They're just born with it, and then vitiligo is autoimmune. Okay, now let's take a look at eczema. So we need to know that eczema is supposed to be a disorder. Well, there's actually many different types of eczema and dermatitis, right? It's an allergic reaction that manifests as dry, itchy patches of skin that resemble rashes. So there, right, like I said, there's many different types of eczema and dermatitis, but they'll all have the itching, they'll all have the redness, and they'll all have the dry skin. That's what they'll all have in common. And then acne, right, acne is supposed to be an overproduction and accumulation of sebum. That's supposed to block hair follicles. Then for cancers of the skin, I wouldn't really worry too much about these in depth. You just need to know that they are cancers of the skin, but that's about it. Um, So, right, the cancers of the skin are basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and then melanoma. And that melanoma is supposed to be the deadliest skin cancer. This is the one that's going to cause that's malignant. Yeah, melanoma is malignant. Okay, then for bed sores, we need to know that bed sores are also known as debicitous ulcers. So the debicitous ulcers, or in other words, the bed sores, those are supposed to be caused by constant, long-term, unrelieved pressure on certain parts of the body that are bony. And basically, the bony area is going to cut off the blood supply, basically, as the bone presses on the blood vessels for long enough and right cuts off the blood supply, then the tissues in that area start to die. And then as they die, they're going to get worn away. Okay, and so it leaves behind basically this crater in the skin, a hole in the skin. And then from there, because it's like I said, a crater in the skin, then what that's going to do is that makes it very vulnerable to infection. Bacteria are able to get into the body very easily. And this is actually how the people can die from debicitous ulcers or bed sores, is because of the infection that results. The people that are most at risk for the debicitous ulcers, also known as the bed sores, yes, it definitely can be the elderly, but they're not the only ones. Really, anybody with a mobility issue is at high risk for a debicitous ulcer. So anybody who has, yeah, like I said, a mobility issue. So that could be, for example, people that are morbidly obese because they're like maybe like 500, 600 pounds. Yeah, they're going to have difficulty moving on their own. Or perhaps maybe people that are in comas, people that are paralyzed. People that are paralyzed, they're at very high risk for the debicitous ulcers because they don't even have any sensation. So most people, for sure, if they're uncomfortable, they're going to think, oh, I need to turn over. I need to get up and walk around. They're at least going to have that sensation. But people that are paralyzed don't get that at all. So they're definitely a very high risk. And even if they're consciously aware and consciously thinking, oh, I need to get up and move around, they're not able to do that on their own. And then definitely people that are in comas, they can't move on their own, so they're very, very high risk for the debicitous ulcers. The best way to, right, basically to treat them is to prevent them. We're just supposed to prevent them from forming at all. The way to prevent them is by changing the position of the patient, rotating the patient. So, for example, if they're lying on their right side, we make sure to flip them over to their left side. If they're on their left side, then we put them lying on their back. Usually the rule of thumb is about every 2 or 3 hours to rotate the patient. But I mean, it may be different from facility to facility. And then, right, once the debicitous ulcer forms, and also it's very hard to detect. The early stages of debicitous ulcers, they They may not look like much. They may just kind of look like reddish skin, irritated skin, but you may not be able to really tell that there's a problem until it's too late. Um, but yeah, once they form, basically they require a lot of monitoring and cleaning to make sure that they're not going to get infected. Okay. All right, let me have you try some of these questions. 9 through 15. You can
Okay.
either answer them one at a time or you can wait till you're done with all of them. Either one is fine.
Yes, ma'am. Okay.
Okay. What did you get?
All right, let's see. For 9, I got A.
Okay. 10.
For 10, I got C.
Okay.
For 12, I got B.
Mm-hmm.
And for 13, I have B. And for 15, I have A.
Okay, so the only one you missed was number 9.
Ah,
So, right, it says, which of the following is not a function of the hypodermis? So, what does the hypodermis have in it?
the hypodermis cells.
What kinds of cells? Anytime you think hypodermis, you should think adipose.
Adipose fat cells.
Right. So really, we need to see, well, what are the purposes of fat? Does fat do A? Does fat protect the organs underneath?
No, ma'am. It helps
It,
maintain the body temperature.
well, actually, it does protect
Oh,
because first you have to go through skin, then you'd have to go
okay.
through fat, then you'd have to go through muscle, and then you'd have to go through bone in order to get to an organ. So yes, it does protect organs. It cushions them and protects them. And then, like you said, it does do B. It does keep us warm. Does fat store energy?
Yes, ma'am.
Hmm. So it's actually supposed to be C. The
Yes, ma'am.
reason, okay, so the reason why it's C, a lot of people get confused by this because they see blood vessels and they think, yeah, there are blood vessels in the hypodermis. But the problem is that it's saying that it's a source of blood vessels in the epidermis. There aren't supposed to be any blood vessels in the epidermis. There are no blood vessels that are coming from the hypodermis going up to the epidermis. And that's what C was kind of implying.
Okay.
Okay, but the rest of them are correct. I think there were two more. Yeah, just two more.
17. Okay.
Okay,
So for 17, I picked C, and for 21, I picked C.
perfect. Okay. All right, we can stop there for today.